Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's live webinar session on two-year college transfers. We hope that you and your families are staying happy and healthy during this time. My name is Jordan Lysak, and I will be joined by Mike Bazemore. We're both assistant directors on the Division II Academic and Membership Affairs staff. So just want to run through some of the objectives of this session. So first, we will begin by taking some time to review the recent and temporary relief provided by the Division II Administrative Committee in response to the impact that COVID-19 has had on two-year college transfers. Next, we will turn our attention to the base legislation as it's laid out in the Division II manual and how it generally applies to two-year college transfers. During this, we'll walk through an approach for you all to maybe consider utilizing on campus when making evaluations of incoming two-year college transfers. And finally, Mike will close us out with walking through a couple of case studies that show the application of that legislation. So as everyone's likely aware, on May 6, 2020, the Division II Administrative Committee provided a self-applied two-year college transfer waiver. This waiver was designed to provide relief of the two-year college transfer requirements for only those prospective student athletes transferring for the upcoming 2020-21 academic year. Just as a note, for all other two-year college transfers, the base application of the legislation would continue to apply. So those that would be transferring outside of the 2020-21 academic year, or maybe they do not meet the requirements that we'll lay out shortly, the base application of the legislation would apply to those. So who has access to this self-applied waiver? So as I just stated, those PSAs that are transferring for the 2020-21 academic year that were enrolled in all necessary courses to complete the transfer requirements entering the spring 2020 term, and entering the spring 2020 term, the PSA was on track to meet the four criteria outlined by the Administrative Committee. Something I'll note here, throughout these next couple of slides, you'll see the phrase spring 2020 term, and this was designed to include both the spring 2020 for semester institutions as well as the winter spring 2020 for quarter institutions. The four criteria that I just mentioned that were established by the Administrative Committee include being enrolled in all necessary coursework to fulfill the 2 full-time semesters or 3 quarters, having 12 transferable hours for each full-time term, having those English, math, science credit hour requirements, and posting a 2.2 GPA entering the spring 2020 term. As you can kind of see here, the GPA piece is the only thing that the PSA must have prior to the spring term, whereas the other requirements are that the PSA was enrolled in those, in that necessary coursework to meet the requirements 1, 2, and 3. As I previously stated, all of the previously stated criteria must be met for the two-year college transfer PSA to have access to that self-applied waiver. If the PSA doesn't meet the criteria, as always, the institution has the option to submit a waiver through RSRO. A couple of additional things I want to highlight before moving on. The Administrative Committee, as you all likely are aware, also issued a waiver of the requirement that a student athlete must have the 9 credit hours from their last full time of enrollment. So that's another thing to keep in mind here with your two-year college transfer PSAs. Just a final note, there are plenty of resources that are available surrounding the actions taken by the Administrative Committee in response to COVID-19, and these can be found on ncaa.org. Some things that you'll see there when you go onto the Division II compliance page are the chart of actions taken, and then the COVID Q&A document that our staff has prepared. These resources would be extremely helpful for all of you in understanding the application of not only this self-applied waiver, but all the other actions taken. So we're going to switch gears here a little bit, move away from the COVID-19 discussion and turn to look at the base application of the two-year college transfer legislation. So while we have that self-applied waiver that we just discussed as it relates to COVID-19, this review is equally as important because it covers those PSAs that might not have access to the self-applied waiver or those transfers that occur in future years. So you can think of this discussion that we're about to have as the way that the Division II manuals in the bylaws traditionally approach those two-year college transfers. A couple of things to consider when approaching and evaluating a two-year college transfer. You want to think about a bunch of different questions, but these three big ones should be at the forefront of your evaluation. So, what was their qualifier status? Is this transfer PSA a qualifier, partial qualifier, non-qualifier? What's their enrollment history? Within this, you can think about, have they attended other four-year institutions or two-year colleges? How many terms have they been enrolled full-time, or how many times have they even transferred? And finally, what credits in GPA have they earned, and at what point in their enrollment were these things earned? So did they obtain all the necessary two-year college transfer credits, or did they even potentially graduate from that two-year college? All of these things you will want to consider during that initial evaluation, because it'll kind of direct you towards what legislation might apply or what next steps you need to take on campus when working with this prospective student athlete. Following the initial evaluation that we just talked about, so those considerations to make, and when you have gained an understanding of that PSA's academic history, this should put the PSA into one of three buckets, and these buckets are kind of set out in the legislation. This is how we're going to teach you to approach the transfer evaluation, as it'll guide you towards which legislation applies to your PSA that you're working with. We'll start it off with bucket number one, as this will likely be your most straightforward evaluations that you'll make on your campus. So this is where you determine that the PSA did ultimately graduate from that two-year college that they're coming to you from. So under the legislation, if the PSA did in fact graduate, the only criteria that they must fulfill is that they spent at least 2 full-time semesters or 3 quarters at the two-year, and 25% of their credits were earned at that 2-year that conferred the degree. So within bucket number one, there's actually an exception that we can talk about that you should consider. And this exception relates to those PSAs that have some 4-year college attendance prior to their time at the current 2-year and have graduated from the 2-year after only 1 semester. So it's a little bit different from what we just talked about, because instead of spending the 2 full-time semesters or 3 quarters, they've only spent 1 semester there or 1 term there. So for this group that falls under this exception, the requirements are that if the PSA has only attended for 1 semester or quarter, they must graduate from the 2-year, and that's something to consider, because there are some student athletes that have that previous 4-year attendance and maybe they're ahead on their credits. So here you'll have to look for, did they attend that 2-year for only 1 semester or quarter? And if so, did they graduate? Next, we'll take a look at bucket number 2. So these are the PSAs that were classified as a qualifier, have no previous 4-year institution attendance prior to enrolling at their 2-year college, but have only spent 1 term at the 2-year. So this is a little bit different from the exception that we just talked about, because this group of PSAs did not graduate. For this group, things that must be met are that the PSA attended the 2-year for at least 1 term, so either 1 semester or quarter, have 12 transferable hours for each full-time term, and post a 2.2 transferable GPA. For the GPA, this is something that's legislated within the manual, but just as a reminder, we calculate that GPA using all of the courses that would transfer into your institution, regardless of the grade. We're not just taking the GPA that's provided by the 2-year college. So while this is a little bit of an extra step, it ensures that the appropriate evaluation is being made on your campus. And third and finally, we have bucket number 3. So these are all other 2-year college PSAs that did not fulfill the requirements set forth in buckets 1 or 2. So this would encompass all other qualifiers, partial qualifiers, or non-qualifiers. The PSAs that fall into bucket number 3 must fulfill all of the following requirements. So at the 2-year, they must have completed 2 full-time semesters or 3 quarters, post 12 transferable hours for each full-time term, fulfill the credit hour requirements for English, math, and science that you can see on the screen here, and post a 2.2 transferable GPA. And again, we're going to be calculating that GPA in the legislated way. By breaking out the evaluation into these three buckets, it should make it a little bit easier on your campus to determine not only what legislation is applicable, but it'll also clearly lay out what the two-year college transfer PSA has and has not fulfilled. Before I pass it over to Mike for a few case studies on this topic and to show you the application of the legislation here, I just want to highlight a few important notes to remember. So always think about the PSA's path to your institution and their enrollment history. I know that's something that was highlighted at the beginning, but that's so important. It helps with determining what bucket, what legislation applies, everything like that. So if this PSA has never attended a four-year college, all semesters or quarters are considered when making the evaluation. However, if the PSA does have the previous four-year attendance, we're only considering the hours earned at the two-year college after the PSA's initial four-year college enrollment. When making the evaluation, if the PSA ultimately does not meet all of the necessary criteria that was laid out, so maybe they're short on the GPA or they don't have the English, math, or science, a waiver is always an option for you. A couple more things to highlight here. For those two-year college PSAs that are classified as a qualifier, there are certain exceptions that are available to them. So during your evaluation, remember to consider this as well prior to filing that waiver. So these exceptions are laid out in the manual for you, and they include things such as discontinued or non-sponsored sport or the two-year non-participation. Finally, some student athletes the student athletes must always have the 9 transferable hours from their last full-time term of enrollment. And I noted this earlier that with actions taken by the administrative committee, this is a little bit different for this upcoming academic year, but traditionally this is a requirement that must be met for their last full-time term of enrollment. So with that, that concludes kind of our highlights and run through of the legislation. So I will now turn it over to Mike Bazemore so he can walk us through some of his case studies to show the way that the legislation applies to certain situations that you may see on your campus. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Jordan. Great start, great start. And so for those in the attendance that have been to our regional rules, I'm sure you are familiar with our format where we tend to give the base application on the front end, and on the back end, we either have an activity set up or we go through case studies as a way to bridge the gap between the application and how you apply it on campus. So this is going to follow that same format, and I'm going to take you through 5 case studies, and hopefully you have some great takeaways for you to increase your skill set on campus when it comes to certifying your 2-year transfers. So as you see on the screen there, we have our certification steps. And as Jordan previously mentioned, the first thing we must do is to confirm the enrollment history of that student athlete. Now, as you see, I have attributes in parentheses, and I'll dig into that on our next slide. But for the most part, what I'm referring to is the identity, or how do we identify this 2-year transfer? Is it a traditional 2-4 transfer, a 2-2-4 transfer, a 2-4-2-4 transfer, or any other variation of 2-year transfer that we come across on campus? Now, from that, step 2 will be to determine which bucket is my student athlete going to fall into. Okay, now we're well aware that we know that everything is not going to be as clean cut as we would like it to be or hope it to be. And so some of our student athletes, once we go through the certification process, they may have some deficiencies. So how do we articulate or communicate to that student athlete or to the coach recruiting that student athlete how to rectify those deficiencies, if possible, prior to them actually transferring to our institution? And so the attributes from what I was speaking to on the previous slide. And when we were coming up with this session, as we have, we had a 2-year transfer session in the previous regional rules, we were looking at kind of a different spin to familiar material and information. And so I can remember when I was on campus, it was kind of like a game to me where when I would receive that student athlete's transcript, I would quickly try to identify what are the bare minimum benchmarks this student athlete has to fit in our certification bucket. So that's what I came up with, the particular attributes. Those are just simply identifying the bare minimums from which what a student athlete will need to meet in order for them to fit in one of our 3 buckets. Now, as a point of clarification, you'll recognize that I have the 9-credit PTD requirement slightly off-centered. The reason being is because there are 2 components when it comes to certifying our 2-year transfers. First component is referring to the 3 buckets and the 2-year transfer requirements. The second component is looking at the 9-credit progress toward degree requirement. So those are the 2 components when it comes to fully certifying a student athlete, and both have different implications in regards to a student athlete's eligibility once they transfer to your institution. So our case studies, speaking to scenario number 1. Amanda, she's a partial qualifier, a 224 transfer. She was enrolled full-time at community college during the 2019 fall semester, and she transferred to Indianapolis Tech Community College during the 2020 spring semester and 2020-21 academic year, graduating from Indy Tech during the spring of 2021. Amanda has earned 45 transferable credits from Indy Tech, 12 of those credits coming from the 2021 spring term. So here is a reminder of the attributes that we will be certifying Amanda under. So let's debrief. Now, as a reminder for our steps, step 1 was confirming her enrollment history. So several slides ago, I went through Amanda's enrollment history. Now we're on step 2. Which bucket is Amanda going to fall under or fall in? Amanda's going to fall in bucket number 1. She graduated from Indy Tech, okay? Now, as a reminder from the presentation that Jordan spoke on previously, to be in bucket number 1, a student athlete must have 2 full-time semesters or 3 quarters at that 2-year college that they graduated from, and also 25% of the credits that that student athlete has earned must come from that 2-year college that awarded that degree. So as you recall, Amanda, she was at Indy Tech for 3 semesters and she graduated. So let's see how her enrollment history matches up with the attributes that she needs to meet. 224 transfer. She has a minimum of 2 semesters at her previous 2-year college, right? She had 3 total at Indy Tech. She did graduate. She graduated from Indy Tech during the spring of 2021, so she does have her associates. So, as a review, for bucket number 1, Amanda is meeting those benchmarks. That's component number 1. Component number 2, as we recall, Amanda had 45 transferable credits. 12 of those credits are coming from the spring of 2021. So Amanda would be certified as eligible. Okay, she's meeting both components. Component number 1, if she's being certified under bucket number 1 as a graduate from a 2-year college, and she also has a minimum of 9 transferable credits from the previous full-time term. So she's meeting component number 1 and component number 2 within the certification process. So Amanda is eligible. Moving on to case study number 2, Mike, who's a qualifier. The 2-4 transfer. Mike was full-time at Philadelphia Community College during the 2020-21 academic year. Mike has 30 transferable credits, 12 earned during the 2021 spring semester. Mike has 8 English, 4 math, and 6 science credits that's transferring in, Mike also has a transferable 3.3 grade point average. Here's a reminder of the attributes from which we will try to certify Mike under. Let's debrief. We did step one. We know Mike's enrollment history. Let's move on to step two. Which bucket is Mike falling into? Bucket number three, all other qualifiers, partial qualifiers, and non-qualifiers. As you recall, if you were in attendance during the previous two-year session several years ago, this is kind of our catch-all bucket, which we tend to use for most of our two-year transfer certifications. And as you recall, in order for a student athlete to be certified in bucket number three, they need to have at a minimum completed 2 full-time semesters at that two-year college, have a 12 transferable credit average per full-time term, and also the subject matter requirements, the 6 English, the 3 math, the 3 science. You need to have that requirement and the 2.2 transferable GPA. Let's break down Mike and see which attributes he meets. Well, Mike was enrolled for the full academic year at Philadelphia Community College, so he meets the 2-semester requirement. Remember, Mike is transferring again at 3.3, so he meets the minimum 2.2 GPA requirement. And Mike was transferring in 30 credits in 2 semesters. I'm no math major, but you know, Mike is well over the 12 credit average per full-time term. As far as the subject matter requirements, Mike is meeting those as well, as he transferred in 8 English, 4 math, and 6 science. So that's component number 1. Component 2, Mike is meeting that as well. As you recall, Mike transferred in 12 credits from the spring 2021 term. So Mike is meeting component number 1, and he's also meeting component number 2 within our 2-year transfer certification process. So therefore, Mike is going to be certified as eligible. Okay, moving on to case study number 3, Zach. Zach is a qualifier. He's a 2-4 transfer. Zach has 15 credits. Zach took 15 credits online at NCAA Community College during the 2020 fall semester. All of the credits that Zach has completed and passed are transferable, and Zach has a 3.5 transferable GPA. As a reminder, here are the attributes that we will certify our 2-year transfer under. So let's debrief. As we stated previously, we know Zach's enrollment history during the previous 2 slides. Now moving on to step 2, which bucket is Zach going to fall into? Bucket number 2. Zach is a qualifier with no 4-year college attendance and only 1 term of attendance at a 2-year college. Let's dig deeper into Zach's enrollment. So as a reminder, if a student athlete is going to fit in bucket number 2, they need to, at a minimum, have a 2.2 transferable GPA, have the 12 credit average per full-time term, and they must attend that 2-year college for only 1 semester, and they do not have any previous 4-year enrollment history. So which benchmarks are Zach meeting? Zach was only enrolled 1 semester online at NCAA Community College. Zach's transferring in at 3.5 GPA, so he meets the minimum GPA requirement. And Zach is meeting the 12 credit requirement as well, as all 15 of his classes he took, he passed. They are transferable, which will lead Zach to also meeting component number 2, as those 15 credits are from his most previous full-time term. Those are transferring in to the 4-year institution. So Zach's is meeting component number 1, component number 2, and Zach is going to be eligible under bucket number 2. Let's dig into some more challenging case studies. Scenario number 4, Jordan. He has no academic certification. He's a 2-4 transfer. was full-time at Jacksonville Community College for the 2019-20 and 2020 academic years. He received a D in his second 3-credit English course. NCAA State does not accept grades below a C. Jordan earned 48 transferable credits, but only 9 from the 2021 spring term. Jordan has a 2.5 transferable GPA, 3 English, 3 math, and 4 science transferable credits. And here's a reminder of the attributes that we are trying to certify Jordan under, or Jordan with. Let's be brief. We know Jordan's enrollment history from the previous 2 slides. Let's look into which bucket Jordan's going to fall into. Bucket number 3, as Jordan did not graduate, but he did, however, complete 2 full-time terms at the community college. All right, and as a reminder for bucket 3, that's kind of our catch-all, where you need to meet various requirements, such as the subject matter requirements, the minimum GPA requirements, and also the 12-credit average requirement for full-time terms. Let's look more into what Jordan meets up with. So Jordan, he is a 2-4 transfer. As a reminder, he has a minimum of 2 full-time semesters at Jacksonville Community College. Jordan is transferring in a 2.5 GPA, so he's meeting the minimum GPA requirement as a 2-year transfer, certifying under bucket number 3. He has the math requirement. Jordan also has the science requirement. But one thing Jordan is lacking, 2 things Jordan is lacking. One would be the 6-credit English requirement, as during his enrollment history, we discovered that Jordan only has 3 English credits. As NCAA State, they do not accept grades below a C. Okay, so that's one deficiency that Jordan will need to rectify. And so being as though Jordan did not meet that requirement, Jordan also is going to be deficient the 12-credit average. However, Jordan did meet the progress toward degree requirement. So being as though Jordan does not meet all of the requirements for bucket number 3, Jordan is going to be ineligible. Okay? Now, in terms of when we come into a student athlete that is ineligible, hopefully we catch this in time so we can properly advise that student athlete to hopefully enroll into a summer course for them to rectify that deficiency prior to them transferring. Because once they transfer, they are not allowed to take a course at your institution to rectify a 2-year transfer requirement. And if for whatever reason Jordan cannot rectify this deficiency, there are waiver opportunities, as Jordan also spoke to in the beginning of this presentation. So we do get questions in RSRO in terms of which waiver to file for student athletes. So this particular waiver would be a 2-year transfer waiver, as Jordan is deficient a 2-year transfer requirement. Moving on to our final case study, scenario number 5. Tony's a qualifier, a 424 transfer. Enrolled full-time at Michigan State University during the 2019 fall semester. Enrolled part-time at Lansing Community College during the 2020 spring semester. Continued at LCC full-time during the 2020-21 academic year. Graduated from LCC. Tony earned 45 credits, 30 coming from LCC, as a 2.15 transferable GPA, 6 English, 6 math, and 5 science transferable credits from MSU. Tony has 8 transferable credits from the 2021 spring semester. Here's a reminder of the attributes that we are certifying Tony with. Let's debrief. We know Tony's enrollment history. We did step 1. Step 2 is identifying the bucket that Tony is going to fall into. Bucket number 1, Tony graduated from LCC. So we're going to try to certify her under bucket number 1. And as a reminder, bucket number 1, you need to meet 2 benchmarks. Be enrolled 2 full-time semesters from that graduating 2-year college, and also 25% of the credits that you earned must come from that 2-year college that awards that degree. So as we recall, Tony's a 424 transfer, transferring from MSU to LCC. Now, at a minimum, remember, she enrolled part-time for spring 20, but then she continued her enrollment and was full-time during the 2020-21 academic year. And she graduates from LCC. So she's meeting the benchmarks under bucket number 1 to be certified as a 2-year transfer. However, if you quote the last bullet within her enrollment history, Tony only had 8 transferable credits from her most previous full-time term. So Tony is deficient component number 2 in our certification process. So therefore, Tony is currently ineligible. Okay, as a reminder, there are 2 components when it comes to certifying our 2-year transfers. Component number 1 is the 2-year transfer requirements in those 3 buckets. So Tony's meeting that under bucket number 1. But in terms of bucket number 2, she is deficient that. And so if this was the summer and it was a late recruit, obviously Tony cannot rectify that deficiency. So the institution would need to file a waiver. And we just want to make a point of clarification in the different waivers that can be filed, being as though the deficiency is a progress toward degree deficiency, as she's lacking the non-transferable credits. The institution would file a progress toward degree waiver for Tony. So I just want to identify the differences and waivers. And speaking for myself, I would always reach out to NCAA staff to make sure I was following the correct waiver. And we try to do the best job possible in terms of making sure that we are being efficient with your time and letting you know which waivers to file on the front end, as it just helps the entire process when we are actually certifying or processing the waivers at the national office. So those were our case studies and our presentation. And just want to articulate some key takeaways from this session. After you have the enrollment history confirmed, we just want you to understand which bucket you are using to start your analysis. That's going to be the catalyst for your 2-year transfer certification process. From that, once you identify if that student athlete is going to be eligible or ineligible, if they are ineligible, we need to advise those student athletes properly, advise the coach in terms of what that student athlete needs to rectify those deficiencies prior to them transferring to our institutions. Now, as a reminder, there are 2 components within the entire 2-year transfer certification process. First component, the 2-year transfer requirements. Those are the 3 buckets that we discussed earlier. The second component is the transferable 9, the progress toward degree waiver. And those are going to dictate if a student athlete cannot rectify those deficiencies, we have waiver opportunities available. So we have a 2-year transfer waiver, and we also have a progress toward degree waiver. But as I stated before, if you have a question on which waiver to submit, you can always reach out NCAA staff, and we can coach you up to inform you on which waiver to submit. So with that being said, I will open the floor to questions. If you want me to review another case study, I can do that as well.
So Mike, I'll actually jump in here. I was taking a look at some of the questions, and it looks like we received a lot of the same types of questions surrounding both the COVID waiver and some of the base legislation. So I can highlight some of those right now. So as it relates to the COVID waiver, if the student athlete that you're working with needed summer school to meet those 2-year college transfer requirements, they would not have access to the self-applied waiver provided by the administrative committee. However, like we've tried to say throughout this, the waiver opportunity through RSRO, so the traditional waiver opportunity, is always available to those student athletes. So a couple other things with the COVID waiver as it relates to the 9-hour requirement that I spoke about. So that's waived as part of the PTD blanket waiver that AdCom put forward. So not within this 2-year college transfer self-applied waiver, but it's under the PTD blanket waiver. And that's accessible as long as the last full-time term that student athlete was enrolled in was spring 2020. A couple other things here. So there were also several questions on the self-applied waiver as it relates to the English, math, and science requirement, and if that student athlete is not meeting those. So if that student athlete is not meeting the English, math, or science, but they happen to be meeting the other 3 requirements laid out by the administrative committee, they would not, they do have access, they do not have access to the self-applied waiver, but again, the traditional RSRO waiver opportunity is available. Now we'll kind of walk through some of those base legislation types of questions that we received. I know that this is something that was part of my portion, but specifically looking at that transferable GPA and how to calculate that. So with that, you will look at you know, all the courses that are normally transferable, even if it is not an acceptable grade to your institution. So calculating that, you'll have to still consider those all grades accessible, and you can find how that's laid out in bylaw 145453. Finally, one last couple of things that I want to highlight here as it relates to the requirements for qualifiers with more than 1 term. So for the credit hours that are required, so you have a student athlete that falls into bucket number 3. So all other qualifiers, partial qualifiers, non-qualifiers that have attended for more than 1 term. So the requirements are that they completed at least 2 semesters or 3 quarters, and they have that average of 12 credit hours for at least 12 semester or 12 quarter hours of transferable credits. And then they would be required to have that the English, math, and science. So 6 semester or 8 quarter hours of English, 3 semester or 4 quarter hours of math, or 3 semester or 4 quarter hours of the natural or physical science. And then again, the 2.2 GPA. Finally, the thing that I'll highlight is, you know, what makes something an English class, what classifies it as a science class when you're doing these evaluations. So this is ultimately based on how your institution as the certifying institution classifies it. And again, please take a look at if you have any questions with the waivers that you may be working on, or different things that you're working through and you're not sure which waiver to file. You can always take a look at the waiver tip sheet on the Division II compliance page on ncaa.org. So Mike, I will turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Jordan. We want to thank you for joining us today for our webinar. If you have any follow-up questions regarding the information presented, please submit those in RSRO, as we are aware that transfer questions can be very fact-specific, and we want to make sure that we are properly advising you. So with that, you have a nice day.